Hi there, Elise Dewsberry here with another installment of my monthly vlog on how to get no feedback from Elise. I wanted to talk for a couple minutes today about the differences between a two-act structure and a one-act structure. Um, and by that I mean the standard show that is something like 2.5 hours with an hour to an hour and a half first act and a 15-minute intermission and then a 45-minute to an hour second act, versus the trend these days to have about a 90-minute or 90-minute max intermissionless one act. So it's not the same as a one act that's meant to be shorter and maybe two of them are in an evening, but a show that is a full-length show, but it runs somewhere between 75 and 90 minutes and has no intermission. There was a day when that was absolutely taboo because so many theaters felt like they absolutely needed to have an intermission in order to sell merchandise and food and whatnot. But so many theaters, even on Broadway these days, let people take their food into the theater and do their merchandising afterwards, and et cetera, that there's not so much pushback about that anymore. And people's attention span has shortened considerably. And so people are less upset. They don't feel like, oh, I didn't get my money's worth because it was only an hour and a half long and there was no intermission. So in general, there is acceptance of the idea of that kind of a piece. Many years ago, in the days of the well-made play, plays were often three acts with two intermissions, or there would be a sort of a break between Act One and Act Two, even though there wasn't an intermission. Maybe there wasn't an intermission until before Act Three, but between Act One and Act Two, there would be something in the stage directions that would say, the curtain closes for 1 minute to designate the passage of a month, and then the curtain comes back up. That is a very old-fashioned approach to the way shows are put on stage these days. Nowadays, especially with a musical, we expect things to be much more cinematic. So we don't expect that the lights will go out at the end of a scene and we'll sit there and check our program and see what's next while we hear some stuff moving around on stage and the set changes and then the lights come up and we're in a new place. Things flow much more now. And so even though you'll have different scenes, they tend to flow one, and that doesn't mean that the lights never go down, but what tends to happen is the lights go down in one area and come up in another immediately. So we're not sitting there waiting. So that when the lights actually do black out and we have an intermission, the standard these days is that there's one act and an intermission and then a second act. Or there is just, one complete act with no intermission. So what's the difference between those two things, and how do you decide where your show fits? I find myself more and more finding reasons to recommend to people that they might consider the intermissionless one act version of a show between 75 minutes and 90 minutes. Why do I do that? Why do I recommend that? Why do I recommend that for some shows and not others? And how could you apply that to your own work? In a nutshell, it's a structural choice that has to do with the storytelling, how you tell the story and how much story you have to tell. So let me try to explain that. So in a standard two-act show, the way they function nowadays, you start the show and you introduce us to the characters and you have an inciting incident and the conflict and the tension rises and things reach a head. And usually there's some kind of big moment at the end of Act One, a cliffhanger event, something, it can't, usually it's, something terrible has happened or is about to happen to our lead character, and the lights go out with us going, oh no, what's going to happen next? And so we go to intermission, but we are very anxious to come back and see what's going to happen next. It's occasionally it's possible that sometimes things are all great and it's wonderful at the end of Act One, but we still want to come back and see what's going to happen next because maybe we have a sneaking suspicion it's not going to stay wonderful. Whatever. There is that rising action that takes us to the moment of intermission. Then we go away. When we come back from intermission, you need to get the audience back again. So you can't start them out at that same fever pitch that you ended the first act. You don't have that ability. They've been out, they've gone to the bathroom, they've been talking to people, they've had a drink. You got to get them back. And so what usually happens is this ramping up that happened to the end of the first act you have to start at a lower place and maybe gentle them in, or maybe hit them with some number that doesn't have anything to do with anything, so they can sort of get their minds back into the show, but you're not progressing the plot right away. That, you know, oftentimes second act openings are like that. It's just like, hey, you're, you know, let's do something fun to get you back, or something, whatever. But you got to, however you do it, you got to start ramping up again and get things to a pitch where the conflict is enough that, you know, that you're going to have a resolution and a denouement. So the basic shape is, you know, the beginning, the ramping up, the first act, and then you got to climb that hill again and get to the end. For the intermissionless one act structure, 75 minutes to 90, and usually, I mean, the reason I say 75 to 90 minutes, anything less than 75 minutes is going to feel like an actual one act, and people are going to feel like there should be more happening this evening. That's not enough. Anything longer than 90 minutes, and frankly, people need to go to the bathroom and they start to get pretty antsy. So that seems to be, you can push it a little bit, 5 or 10 minutes, but generally speaking, you don't want to be going longer than 90 minutes. So what is the difference in how the rising and falling action works in an intermissionless show? In an intermissionless show, you're probably going to start with the same thing. You have to introduce us to the characters. There's an inciting incident. Things start to mount. They mount. They mount. You don't need to have a cliffhanger. You can just keep pushing and keep pushing until you get to the climax and the resolution and the denouement. You don't have to have that big moment that ends the first act and then ramp things back up again. You can just have one steady upward climb. What are the pros and cons of that? Not every show has a natural moment that makes sense for this big first act finale moment. For different reasons. Sometimes it's just because there isn't a moment that really, you find yourself having to manufacture a moment that's important enough to merit you know, that kind of tension and an act break. And you make something up, and sometimes it just doesn't feel like it's necessarily that important, or maybe that event happens too early or too late, and so your show is sort of lopsided. So you find yourself struggling trying to figure out what is my act break moment, and what is, you know, when does it happen in time, and when does it happen in the drama of the story? And it isn't always clear. Sometimes it's because the universe of the show is so unique that if you break the sense of being in that universe, trying to get people back into it is not going to be easy. It's never easy, but in some instances, it's just that much harder. So that's another reason why you might not want to do that. You might want to keep them in that world. So you might want to keep them in the world of the play and not allow them out of it. You might want to not have to arbitrarily try to figure out and invent a moment that deserves an act break. And then the other thing is, sometimes if you can find a place that's a big, you know, you can take us to a big moment that's very important, but there just isn't very much story left after that. So then you find yourself trying to spin out, well, how do I get a whole second act out of this? How short can my second act be? Because there just isn't that much story left. So sometimes it's about that. Do you have enough story to merit getting to that big moment and then ramping back up and having it happen again? And sometimes the story just works better if you plow right through and don't try to make that break. Don't try to figure out how to have enough story to tell after that important moment, because that really super important moment could be a penultimate moment before the climax. You don't have to have a break after it. And so there doesn't have to be as much left after it. So when I find someone submits to me a show that feels like it would do better if the audience didn't leave the world of the play at any point, if it feels like they're trying to manufacture an act break and there isn't a natural place that makes sense, if it feels like there just isn't enough story and they're padding it to try and get 2 acts, those are the moments when I say there is no shame in saying this story lends itself more to an intermissionless 90-minute one act. And there are plenty of places in the world these days that will be 100% fine with that. So you don't have to worry about it. So think about the structure of your story, how it's being told, and whether it would benefit from a 2-act structure or a 1-act structure. And it's going to be different. The answer is different. So you need to think that through, but it's worth considering. Okay. So thanks, and we'll catch you next time, and toodaloo.